Hi, I'm Nick Barter, and I'm going to present some research on perceptions and questions to derive sustainable outcomes. This is exploratory research. It suggests rather than proves. It was done by myself, and the statistical analysis was done with a colleague, Dr. Claire Alston-Knox. Before we get into it, one of the things we're all doing right now is we're all breathing, and we're all breathing in and out, and it helps us work, helps us flow, etc. And one of the things we all do is we eat, and in that regard, I often think about one of the questions I've asked a lot of my students through the years, which is, where is the environment? And after a quizzical look, they all point to their heads and go, it's everywhere, it's even inside me, it constitutes me. And that, I think, is a simple thing that we all can understand. You know, as you're watching this, you're breathing, and you're likely to maybe even be eating. And one of the things to kind of go back in time is that in 1968, we had the Earthrise picture. And that was important because I think it reinforced, if nothing else does, you know, through that image, that we're not separate to everything else. We at a conceptual level, this dotted line, concentric circles, tries to show that we're interrelated to everything else. Everything flows together, rubs together, if you like, and that's why the dotted lines are there. And that, I think, is particularly important in this geological epoch that we have now, where we live in the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene is, you know, we humans are the major shapers of the world around us. And hence, you know, the environment is not something big and separate and something we can't influence. We're shaping our world around us. We're shaping our habitat. However, you know, that's not the world of business theory. Business theory deals in this. It deals in this notion that there's us or an organization very separate to the world or the environment, and the world and the environment is independently given. You know, it's not something we shape or interact with in the same way in that conceptual relationship of concentric circles. And obviously that is a nice idea, but isn't the world we're living in, because the world we're living in is one where we breathe, eat, etc., etc. And all of those things, if you like, are perhaps nearly obvious to us, but not quite obvious to us. And I say nearly obvious to quote an academic colleague, Michael Starrick. Now, what I'm going to present has two core ideas in it. Firstly, it's about individuals' conception of their relationship with nature and the organization they work for and its relationship. And then I'm going to also, the other core idea of this research is whether individuals think a change in language is more or less likely to yield sustainable outcomes. So let me pick up on this change of language piece. One of the common things we might go is, oh, the wind is blowing. And one of the arguments we can make there is the subject verb nature of that language. It means that we think that the wind is separate to the act of blowing. And actually this idea came from the work of a guy called Tim Ingold, who's an anthropologist based out of Aberdeen University. But we know that actually the wind is the blowing. There is no separation. The wind and the act, if you like, are one and the same thing. And that insertion of the word "the" collapses notions of separation. And one of the later things in this research, as well as looking at people's conception of their own relationship, is it asks individuals different types of questions about the air I breathe and the water I drink versus gaseous outputs on surroundings, or solid waste disposed of in my neighborhood versus solid waste disposed of in a disposal site. Which one of those questions is more likely to yield sustainable outcomes? And as you will see, there's some really quite striking results. So the survey was distributed electronically between November 2016 and January 2017. We've got 632 respondents from 43 countries across a range of industries, range of organizational sizes, range of organizational types. And the paper that goes alongside this video explains, you know, the details of that, but it was small organizations to 10,000 plus organizations. It was public sector, not-for-profit through to private PLCs. Now, in terms of age, average age of the people we surveyed was between 20 and 70, but the average age was, 41. In terms of gender, 55% male, 45% female. In terms of education level, 16% had less than post-secondary, 29% bachelors, 44% masters, 11% PhDs. And organizational role, you can see technicians, professionals, managers, and CEOs. There's a lot more professions captured, but we collapsed them into those categories. And first question we asked them was, how do they see themselves? What do they see as their relationship with nature? And this is a question, we used this question, which has been asked by a chap called Schultz out of environmental psychology. And what we found was that people rated themselves across the board. The average was 4.4, but you can see there people were across the range. Very few saw themselves as totally separate. Most people were somewhere in the middle, but a fair few were right at the higher levels of overlap too. And then we changed the question slightly, adapted it slightly, and we said, what about your organization and its relationship with the environment? And what we saw was that actually they invariably rated their organization as much lower, an average of 2.9. So when you put those two together, you can see that actually there's a disconnect between how individuals are rating themselves and how they're rating their organization. And that starts to indicate perhaps that our organizations are not keeping up with us in terms of our own sense of our understanding. And perhaps it indicates that organizations could be braver, a point we'll draw out a little bit more. And one of the things to look at then is, if I rated myself as a 7, on average, where were individuals rating their organization? And you can see there on average they were rating their organization 3.5 categories below. If they rated themselves as a 6, on average they were rating their organization at 3.2 categories below, and so on. And interestingly, what happens is if they rated themselves as a 2, they rated their organization as higher. And if they rated themselves as a 1, they rated their organization as 1.2 categories higher. Now, because this was exploratory research and missing the why, and one of the second stages of this research is to do some deeper dives with organizations. So if you're interested in being part of that research, please get in touch. But what it does indicate strongly is there's a disconnect between how we see ourselves and how we see the organization we work for, and does that impact on morale? And does it indicate that actually there's an ability for our organizations to do more in terms of sustainable outcomes? We also asked, where do you think your organization is in terms of ideal and worst for sustainable outcomes? What would be the ideal relationship for sustainable outcomes, and what would be the worst? And you can see there that everybody thinks the worst relationship would be one of no overlap, and the ideal would be kicking up towards the 5, 6, and 7s, much more overlap. No surprise perhaps, but interesting to reinforce, because remember what we saw was that conventional business theory deals in lack of overlap. And all these respondents certainly see that as being the worst for sustainable outcomes. Then looking at where individuals rated their organization and where they rated ideal, what we saw was that if they rated their organization as a 7, on average they were rating the ideal for their organization as slightly lower. They rated as 6, again, this pattern, but then if they rated their organization as a 5, on average they were seeing the ideal for their organization as being more than where the organization currently is in their view. And if they rated a 4, again, the ideal for the organization would be more than where the organization currently is, and so on, with the biggest gap being if they rated the organization as a 1, the ideal for the organization is much, much higher. And that again indicates that there's ability for organizations to do much more with sustainability. Now we say suggest rather than prove, because there's more research required, but it does indicate perhaps that our organizations are not only not keeping up with us in terms of our own relationships, but the respondents think their organizations can do much more in terms of realizing sustainable outcomes, and much more regarding their conceptual relationship with their surroundings. We then did some statistical analysis, and we grouped individuals and how they rated themselves into low, medium, and high. And you can see the lows were people who rated themselves as 1, 2, or 3 in their own relationship. Mediums were 4 and 5, and highs were 6 and 7s. And what we found was that there was this cluster of people, CEOs and managers, with less than or equal to a bachelor's, who were more likely, that's the black circle, to score themselves low on self, and less likely to score themselves high on self, i.e. high overlap. That pattern was repeated with a group of technicians who less than or equal to bachelor's, who were more likely to score themselves in terms of low overlap and less likely to score themselves in terms of high overlap. We found this cluster of CEOs and managers with masters who were average across the board. And then we found these professionals with PhDs who were less likely to score themselves on no overlap and more likely to score themselves on high overlap. And it starts to indicate that education impacts our sense of overlap. And that concurs with a lot of the environmental psychology literature. We then looked at those clusters, and what we found was that those CEOs and managers with less than a bachelor's were more likely to be male and more likely to have only studied strategy, because we asked individuals, have you studied strategy, have you studied sustainable development, have you studied both, or have you studied neither? The technicians with less than or equal to bachelor's were more likely to be female and more likely to have studied neither. The CEOs and managers with masters, who were average across the board, were more likely to be male, but more likely to have studied strategy and SD, sustainable development. And then the professionals with PhDs were more likely to be female and were average across the board. And this is starting to indicate that perhaps what you study matters. So it's not just education level, but it's subject. Perhaps studying sustainable development makes you more likely to be, average in terms of your own relationship with nature. And the last piece was these questions. This comes back to that wind is blowing, etc. And we asked people, which one of these questions is more likely to yield sustainable outcomes? And solid waste are disposed of in my neighborhood, or solid waste disposed of in a disposal site. And you can see there clearly people said, doesn't matter which way you cut it, the solid waste disposed of in my neighborhood is more likely to yield sustainable outcomes. The water I drink, or on liquid outputs on the environment, the water I drink is more likely to yield sustainable outcomes. The gaseous outputs on the air I breathe, or do they meet regulation? And you see air I breathe. And this indicates to us, and whilst these questions perhaps need refining, more questions need to be developed, it indicates that questions that emphasize proximity, i.e. lack of separation, and our agency, our control, our ability to do something about it, are perhaps important for realizing sustainable outcomes. And that, I think, has implications for business language. So if we were to take and wrap this all up, this exploratory research suggests rather than proves, and more research is required to get to the why, but I think what it shows us is there's a gap between ourselves and our organizations. Our organizations are not where we are, and perhaps this impacts employee morale, perhaps it impacts or shows that our organizations can be bolder, can be braver. We know what makes for the worst and what makes for more ideal in terms of realizing sustainable outcomes for our organizations, and that, I think, points right back at implications for business theory. We know education, or we're starting to see that education matters, and maybe level and maybe what you learn matters. And questions that emphasize proximity and control are better for sustainable outcomes. Now, more questions are needed, but I think this has implications for business language. So, if we want more sustainable outcomes, perhaps simply we want to be changing our language and asking ourselves, would I want to drink this? Would I want to breathe this? Would I want this disposed of in my neighborhood? And if the answer to that is no, is following the logic. There's very conventional sustainable strategies which build off metaphors of circle or conceptions of circle, would allow us to get to strategies that get to yes to those answers, and in so doing would allow us to build more, I would argue, allow us to build more sustainable organizations that are more complicit or congruent, if you like, with this age that we live in, which is the Anthropocene. So if you want to know a little bit more, there's a paper that goes alongside this presentation. And if you would like to be involved in the next stage of research, perhaps as an organization you'd like to be involved, please get in touch. Thanks for your time. Thanks for listening.